asked me how I go about mixing and mastering on the MV8800. I'm going to share that with you today. So let's dig into it. Okay, now there's a little thing called the Q here. What this does is it goes, if you think of it in terms of, let's say from a spectrum of from bass all the way up to treble.
A half a Q is about 2.5 octaves.
And 1 Q
is just over an octave.
So what's happening is,
the smaller I make that Q,
the more frequencies I'm taking out. So right there I'm taking out
a very tiny number of frequencies.
The Q can make it as fine-tuned as you want to pull out very harsh sounds, but at this point half a Q is good enough. I'm okay with that sound. Okay, so that's EQ. Let's go back and finish doing our mix. And there are a few other instruments. So this is what we tend to call pad. It kind of fills the space with long notes. In this case I'm using a symphonic orchestra, just sort of a string symphony. And what I usually do is I'll give the strings a lot of reverb, and I'll move them around in the stereo field so that it kind of gives it a nice presence. Now, something that you need to keep in mind whenever you're doing this panning, often that will reduce the volume of what you're moving around. So the further you move it over, sometimes you may need to adjust up the volume so you can feel its presence. Okay, see that? Okay, cool. And you can give it a little delay if you like, if you want to hear it pinging around, but you typically don't really need to do that too much for strings. And now I've got an electric piano. Again, we're just kind of moving around here, trying to move instruments around so that they fit in the stereo field and they don't bother you, or they feel like they're naturally fitting with the composition. Now what I want to do with this guy is I'm going to move him all the way over so it kind of sounds like a far off, and we give it just a little bit of reverb, but then I'm going to give it a whole lot of delay. Whoops. And remember to turn it up a little bit because you've got it moved so far over. Give it a little bit more reverb. Alright, now we've got a little bit of a flute. And he came in and he's kind of stepping in. So why don't we move him over next to, on the opposite ear, move him next to the EP, and let's duplicate some of the delay settings, see how that sounds. So that way they kind of feel like they're talking to each other. Dial him down a little bit. And dial the EP down a little bit so they're balanced. And notice that the EP sounds a little bit louder, so sometimes you have to adjust the volume. Okay, that's just the basics of mixing. Some additional things to think about mixing is making sure that you get your gain settings proper. That's all involved in setup. I wasn't planning on talking about setup here. If you're interested in setup and gain staging and all of that, I'll be more than happy to do another video. Okay. Whenever you're mixing or mastering on the MV8800, it's important that this volume knob is all the way up. Otherwise, you won't get the actual output that you need inside of the recording. Here's some of the things that I know about effects. One is that there is a wet sound and there's also a concept of a dry sound. Sometimes you can manipulate the wet sound and the dry sound from the effects unit, sometimes from the mixer, sometimes both. But the idea is that the wet sound is a sound that comes out of the effects unit, and the dry sound is a sound that is going into the effects unit. And sometimes you can do a mix between those that appropriately represents the character of the music that you're trying to do. So in certain cases you want a really heavy wet sound. In other cases you want just simply a dry sound. Often when I'm working with musicians that are doing acoustic sets, I do a lot of live sound, and when they do acoustic sets, I often will, let's say if they're playing an acoustic guitar and they're singing, what I'll do is I'll have a little bit of a wet sound on the acoustic guitar, and I'll dial back the wet sound on their vocal, so that it has more of a personal, a homey type touch to it. So, and that's just my own personal preference. I don't know if that, if others have other opinions or better ideas on that, but that's just try to use that the effects to fit the character of the music is my biggest thing that I could probably share with you. And then as far as EQ is concerned, like I said before, I'd much rather dial back as opposed to dial up, because if your sample or your music or a particular vocal has some noise in it, let's say like I have a lot of street noise passing by all the time because this is at my home, right? If that noise is present, and you boost up the EQ on it, basically you're amplifying that noise. So it's a good idea to reduce EQ settings as opposed to gain them up. Another thing that I found useful is that often a musician will lean into a microphone when they're singing in the lower registers, because they have to produce a lot more volume to try to get the same sound. So instead they'll lean into the microphone, and what that causes is what we call a proximity effect, which raises the bass frequencies. And in those cases when you have a musician that's doing that, sometimes you can EQ out a little bit of the low end, somewhere around, I've found somewhere around 125 or so. If you roll off just a little bit, it can kind of help with that proximity effect. Once it's recorded, you're going to have that proximity built in there. So after it's been recorded, sometimes you can EQ out some of that proximity effect, and in fact you'll hear that in the sample that I've done. And another thing about EQ is you can use it to de-ess. Sometimes a musician will sing and you'll hear the S or the P, and sometimes EQ can be used to pull back the sharpness of that sound. Somewhere around, I find that somewhere around 3.5 kilohertz is a place where you can pull back to kind of de-ess or get rid of that the hissing sound. Just take care that you're doing it only on the particular instrument or vocal track that you're de-essing. Otherwise, if you do it for the whole composition, the whole recording, then you could be taking out things like the cymbal, and so you don't want to do that. That's why it's important to get your mix right first, because once you get to mastering, you're manipulating the entire sound, mixed sound. So try to get your mix right.